Have you ever looked at someone who's fluent in a new language and just wondered, how did they do that? Well, you, or maybe someone you know, is still stuck on the basics? It's a super common question. And today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the science of second language acquisition and figure out what really makes the difference. I mean, you've seen it, right? Two people move to a new country, they're there for the exact same amount of time. One of them ends up chatting away like a local, and the other one, well, they're still struggling to order a coffee. What is going on there? What's the secret ingredient?
Well, it's really tempting to just chalk it up to some people having a language gene or a special talent. But the research tells a much more interesting story. There's this famous case study of a learner named Alberto. He was living in an English-speaking country, totally immersed, but he barely made any progress. His story is the perfect example that just being there isn't a magic bullet. Success is this fascinating mix of what's going on inside your head and what's going on in the world around you.
So, here's our game plan for today. We're going to start by looking inside the learner's mind. Then, we'll tackle that huge question about age. After that, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of how we actually learn, explore the massive role society plays, and finally, we'll wrap it all up into a kind of personal blueprint for you. All right, first up, let's talk about the psychological stuff. Think of this as the personal toolkit that every single one of us brings to the table when we start learning a language, whether we know it or not. And the first big tool in that kit is something researchers call language aptitude. You can think of it as your natural underlying knack for learning languages. And study after study shows that this is one of the biggest predictors of who's going to succeed. But aptitude isn't just one single thing. It's actually a few different skills working together. So when you're taking in the language, the input, it's about how good your ear is for new sounds. Then, when you're processing it, it's all about your ability to spot patterns and analyze grammar. And finally, when you try to speak, the output, it comes down to memory, how well you can grab what you've learned. We all have different strengths and weaknesses here. Another huge piece of the puzzle is, of course, your personality. Extroverts tend to be more outgoing. They're often the ones who will just jump into a conversation, even if they make mistakes. And because of that, they just get way more practice. Introverts, on the other hand, might be a little more reserved, and that fear of saying something wrong can actually stop them from getting the speaking time they need. And this isn't just a theory. Check out this quote from a 2003 study. They looked at American students studying abroad, and what they found was wild. Many of the students were so shy or anxious that they would, and I quote, avoid interaction with the native speakers at all costs. It's a perfect example of how our own internal feelings can build a wall around us, cutting us off from the very thing we need to learn. Okay, let's move on to the one everybody talks about, age. Is there really a best before date on our ability to learn a language? Is there some magic window that closes on us? Well, this whole idea comes from something called the critical period hypothesis. It's this theory that there's a biological window, and once it closes, usually around puberty, it becomes way, way harder to become truly fluent. This is the classic explanation for why most adults who learn a new language always keep a bit of an accent. So, what's actually changing as we get older? Well, it seems we switch learning styles. Kids are absolute masters of implicit learning. They just soak up language like a sponge without even thinking about grammar rules. Adults, we tend to rely on explicit learning. We're consciously studying, analyzing the rules, trying to figure it all out. It's basically the difference between absorbing a language and dissecting it. But, and this is a huge but for all the adult learners out there, there's some really good news. Research has found that your grown-up brain has a superpower, analytical ability. And that ability to break things down and understand systems can actually help you perform just as well as younger learners. So yeah, you might lose some of that sponge-like ability, but you gain a powerful new tool to make up for it. Okay, we've looked at who the learner is. Now let's get into the mechanics of it all. How does a language actually move from out there in the world to in here in our brains? Welcome to the engine room. When you boil it all down, learning a language is a pretty simple three-step process. First, you need input. That's hearing or reading the language. Then you have intake. That's the bit of the input that you actually notice and understand. And finally, you have output. That's you trying to use it by speaking or writing. So it all kicks off with input. There's a really famous theory called the input hypothesis from Stephen Krashen, and he argued that we can only learn a language when we understand the messages we're getting. But here's the key. It can't be too easy. The sweet spot is what he called I+1. That's your current level, the I, plus just a little bit more.
It needs to be understandable, but also just tricky enough to push you forward. That sounds great, but how do you get that perfect I+1 input? Well, Michael Long came along and added a crucial piece to the puzzle with his interaction hypothesis. He basically said that input becomes understandable through talking to people. When you ask, "Can you say that again?" or when someone slows down for you, that back and forth is what turns confusing noise into actual useful language you can learn from. And that brings us to the final step, output. Meryl Swain's output hypothesis pointed out that trying to speak or write does something really important. It's not just practice. It forces you to realize what you don't know. You know that moment when you're trying to say something and you just can't find the word or the right grammar? That feeling? That's a learning moment. That's your brain flagging a gap that needs to be filled. We've covered the mind, we've covered the method, but we're not done. It's time to zoom all the way out and look at the final and maybe most powerful factor, the society and the culture you're learning in. A guy named John Schumann came up with something called the acculturation model. And his big idea was that learning a new language is basically the same thing as adapting to a new culture. Remember Alberto from the beginning, the guy who didn't make much progress? Schumann's theory would say it's because he never really connected with the English-speaking culture around him. In this view, how well you learn depends directly on how close you get to that new community. Schumann talked about something he called social distance, which is basically the gap between your home culture and the new one. And it's created by all these big factors. Things like how different the two cultures are, whether your own community tends to keep to itself, and even how long you're planning to stay in the country. All these things can either pull you closer to the new language or push you further away. And then, on top of all of that, there's psychological distance. This is the stuff that's happening inside your own head. Things like your personal motivation, your attitude towards the people and the culture, and of course, the big one, culture shock. These can all create these invisible mental walls that make it so much harder to connect and learn. Phew. Okay, we have gone through everything from brain chemistry to social dynamics. So let's take a breath and see if we can put all these pieces together into something that actually makes sense for your own language journey. When you look at all the research, it really boils down to 4 main pillars of success. First, the mind. That's your own personal aptitude and personality. Second, the age, which really determines if your learning style is more implicit or explicit. Third, the method, how well you're engaging with that cycle of input, interaction, and output. And finally, the milieu, or your environment. That's all about your social and psychological connection to the new culture. And this, right here, is the most important takeaway. You can't go back in time and change your age. You can't magically give yourself a different kind of aptitude, but you absolutely 100% can change your methods and your mindset. So as you look at these 4 pillars, think about your own profile. What is the one thing you could adjust or focus on right now that could unlock a whole new level of potential for you?